The day my son Wesley handed me that golden envelope with a cruise ticket inside, I should have known something was wrong with that smile of his. But when I came back home to get my blood pressure medication that I'd forgotten, I heard Wesley talking on the phone with his wife Rachel. The words coming out of his mouth froze my blood cold. "Don't worry, honey, it's a one-way ticket. When he's out at sea, it'll be easy to make it look like an accident. Nobody will suspect an old man who simply fell overboard." My name is Garrett Sullivan. I'm 67 years old, and at that moment, standing behind the door of my own house, I realized my only son had just signed my death warrant. Now let me tell you something about myself before we get too deep into this mess. I'm not your typical retiree sitting around waiting for the Grim Reaper to come knocking. I did 2 tours in Vietnam back when I was barely old enough to shave, came home to work 40 years at the Ford plant in Houston, and buried my wife Sarah 5 years ago after 35 years of marriage. I've seen enough of life's curveballs to know when someone's trying to pull a fast one on me. If Wesley thought his old man was some helpless retiree who'd go quietly into that good night, he was about to learn how wrong he was. You don't survive Charlie trying to put bullets in your head for 2 years, then spend 4 decades dealing with every kind of scam artist and deadbeat customer at the plant just to get taken down by your own flesh and blood. But standing there in my hallway, listening to my boy plan my murder like he was ordering a pizza, I'll admit something. It hurt worse than any bullet I ever dodged in the jungle. This was the kid I'd carried on my shoulders to Rangers games, the teenager I'd taught to drive stick shift in my old Chevy pickup, the young man I'd walked down the aisle when he married Rachel, even though I had my doubts about that girl from day one. Let me back up and tell you how this whole thing started, because you need to understand the kind of man Wesley turned out to be. 3 days earlier, Wesley had shown up at my ranch house in suburban Houston with this fake smile I hadn't seen since he was 16 and crashed my truck into a mailbox. He was carrying one of those fancy travel agency envelopes, the kind that probably cost more than I used to make in a week back in the day. "Dad," he said, giving me this awkward hug that felt like he was going through the motions. "Rachel and I have been talking, and we think you need a break. You've been working your whole life, and now that you're retired, you should enjoy yourself." Now here's the thing about Wesley. He's always been a smooth talker. Even as a kid, he could convince you black was white if it got him what he wanted. When he was 12, right after Sarah died, I caught him stealing money from my wallet. Not for drugs or anything serious like that. He wanted to buy expensive sneakers like the rich kids at school. Even then, he thought he deserved things he hadn't earned. I should have seen the warning signs back then, but I was grieving and trying to raise a boy alone. I made excuses for him. He's acting out because he lost his mother, I told myself. He'll grow out of it. Well, he never did. When I opened that envelope and saw the cruise tickets, I'll admit my eyes got a little misty. 7 days sailing the Western Caribbean, visiting Cozumel in Jamaica. It was the kind of trip my Sarah had always dreamed about taking, but we never could afford it when Wesley was young and money was tight. Back then, every extra dollar went toward his Little League equipment, his school clothes, his college fund that he eventually blew by dropping out junior year to sell cars. "Son, this must have cost a fortune," I said, looking at those first-class tickets. The old me would have been grateful without question. But 40 years of dealing with people trying to get something for nothing had taught me to look for the angle. "Dad, you deserve this," Wesley replied, but his eyes weren't meeting mine. There was something shifty about the way he kept looking at his phone, like he was expecting an important call. "Besides, you need to get away from all the stress. Dr. Martinez said your blood pressure's been high, right?" That was true enough. Doc Martinez had been on me about my numbers for months, ever since I'd started having those dizzy spells. But something about the way Wesley brought it up, like he'd been planning this conversation, set off those old alarm bells in my head. You learn things in the jungle that civilian life can't teach you. How to read people's intentions before they even know them themselves. How to spot an ambush before it happens. How to trust your gut when something feels wrong, even if you can't put your finger on what it is. My gut was screaming that Wesley was running some kind of con. But Wesley was still my boy, you know? The kid I'd raised alone after Sarah passed, even when he married Rachel against my better judgment. And let me tell you, I had plenty of reasons to doubt that woman from the start. He was still family. Rachel never liked me, not from day one. You could see it in her eyes during family dinners, that look some women get when they think their father-in-law is just dead weight holding back their perfect life. She was always pushing Wesley to ask for money. a down payment for a bigger house, a loan for a newer car, cash to start some business venture that never seemed to pan out. And Wesley, well, he'd always been weak when it came to saying no to a pretty face. Rachel had him wrapped around her little finger tighter than a drill bit in a chuck. "When do I leave?" I asked, trying to sound excited about the cruise. "Day after tomorrow, Dad." "Everything's arranged. You just show up at the port in Galveston with your suitcase." The funny thing is, looking back, I should have caught the eagerness in his voice, like he couldn't wait to get me out of town. But at the time, I was still playing the role of the grateful father, the old man who should be thankful his son remembered he existed. That night, packing my duffel bag, yeah, I still use the same olive drab bag from my army days because why fix what ain't broke? I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut. Wesley had been distant for months, barely calling, making excuses not to come around for our Sunday barbecues. Those cookouts had been our tradition since Sarah died, just the two of us on my back porch, drinking beer and talking about work, sports, life. But lately, those visits had gotten less frequent. Wesley always had some excuse. Work was busy, Rachel had plans, they were dealing with stuff. And now, suddenly, he's Mr. Generous, dropping what had to be $5,000 on a first-class cruise for dear old Dad. I tried to convince myself it was guilt. Maybe Wesley had finally realized all the sacrifices I'd made raising him alone. Maybe he wanted to make up for being such a disappointment. Dropping out of college, bouncing from job to job, that DUI 3 years back that I'd helped pay the lawyer for. You know what I mean? Sometimes we want to believe in our kids so bad that we'll ignore the warning signs right in front of our faces. On departure day, I got up before dawn like I had every morning for 40 years. Old habits die hard, especially when you've spent most of your life punching a time clock. I finished packing my few things, didn't need much for a week at sea, and was heading out to call a taxi when I realized I'd forgotten my blood pressure medication. Now, Sarah used to handle all our medications when she was alive. Had this little pill organizer with days of the week marked on it, made sure I took everything on schedule. Since she passed, I've been flying solo on that front, and sometimes I forget the routine. I went back inside, being quiet so I wouldn't disturb the neighbors, and that's when I heard Wesley's voice from the living room. He was on the phone, and his tone was completely different from the caring son act he'd been putting on. "Yeah, Rachel. He just left for the port." I froze in the hallway, my hand still on that little amber bottle of pills. Something about the way he said it, cold, calculating, made every instinct I'd learned in Vietnam start screaming. No, he doesn't suspect anything. The plan is going perfectly. Plan? What plan? I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear every word. The life insurance is $175,000, and with the house, that's another $220,000. Plus, he's got about $85,000 in savings and his pension. More than enough to pay off my gambling debts and get us back on track. My heart stopped. My own son was talking about my death like it was a business transaction, adding up my assets like line items on an invoice. "Don't worry, honey. The guy I hired knows what he's doing. Make it look like an accident. An old man loses his balance, falls overboard. These things happen on cruises all the time." The pills rattled in the bottle as my hands started shaking. Not from fear, mind you, from pure rage. Wesley had hired someone to kill me. My boy, the kid I'd worked double shifts to put through school, was planning my murder. We'll play the grieving family perfectly. Collect the insurance, sell the house, and start fresh somewhere else. Maybe California, like you always wanted. I had to bite my tongue to keep from charging into that room and confronting him right then and there. But 40 years of factory work had taught me patience, and 2 tours in Vietnam had taught me strategy. Sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing at all. Just listen, learn, and let the other guy think he's got you fooled. I slipped out of that house without making a sound, my mind already working at full speed. Wesley thought he was dealing with some doddering old fool who'd go gentle into that good night. What he didn't know was that his father had survived worse things than a spoiled kid with gambling debts. During the taxi ride to Galveston, watching the Houston suburbs roll by through the window, I started putting together a battle plan. You might be wondering why I didn't just call the cops right then and there. Well, let me tell you something about evidence. Knowing the truth and proving it in court are 2 completely different things. All I had was an overheard phone conversation. Wesley could claim I misunderstood. that I was a confused old man imagining threats that weren't there. No, I needed more than that. I needed proof that would hold up in front of a judge and jury. First thing I needed was information. Who did Wesley hire? How were they planning to do it? When? Where? Second, I needed allies. I was going to be alone on that ship for 7 days with a professional killer hunting me. I'd need help from people I could trust. Third, I needed to document everything. Phone calls, text messages, anything that would show Wesley's intent to have me murdered. The port at Galveston was buzzing with activity when we arrived. Families loading suitcases, couples taking selfies, kids running around excited for their vacation. Everyone was happy, looking forward to 7 days of fun in the Caribbean sun. I was the only one who knew that for me, this might be a one-way trip. The cruise ship was something else, a floating city called the Star of the Caribbean. 12 decks high, probably cost more than my house to build. As I walked up that gangway with my old duffel bag, I felt like David heading out to face Goliath. Except this time, Goliath had hired a professional killer, and I didn't have any divine intervention backing me up. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Sullivan." The young lady checking passengers in was all smiles and professional cheerfulness. "First cruise?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "My son gave me this trip as a gift. Said I needed to relax. How thoughtful. He must love you very much." If she only knew. If she only knew that her son had just purchased what he hoped would be my funeral. My cabin was on the 8th deck, room 847 with an ocean view and a private balcony. Wesley had paid for the works, first class all the way. Probably figured it would be easier to stage an accident from a balcony than from inside the ship where there might be witnesses. I set my bag down and immediately reached for my phone. Time to call in reinforcement. Preston Miller was a private detective I'd met at the VFW hall a few months back. Good man, former Marine, had given me his business card and told me to call if I ever needed help. Miller Investigations. "Preston, this is Garrett Sullivan from the VFW. We met at the Memorial Day barbecue." "Garrett, good to hear from you, brother. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. This was going to sound crazy, but I needed someone on the outside working the angles. I need to hire you for something that's going to sound like the ravings of a paranoid old man. "My son is trying to have me killed." Silence on the other end. I could almost hear him deciding whether I was losing my marbles. "Garrett, that's a serious accusation. You absolutely certain about this?" "Preston," I heard him talking on the phone. "He hired someone to kill me on this cruise and make it look like an accident. He's got gambling debts, $95,000 according to what I heard, and my life insurance plus the house would more than cover it." "Jesus. Where are you now?" "On a cruise ship heading to the Caribbean. I'll be out of contact for 7 days, but when I get back, I need everything you can find on Wesley Sullivan. Debts, associates, bank records, phone records if you can get them. I need to know exactly how deep in the hole he is and who he owes money to." "Understood. I'll start digging immediately." "Garrett, listen to me carefully. You need to be extremely careful out there. If what you're telling me is true, you're in real danger. Don't take any unnecessary risks." "Preston, I didn't survive 2 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of dealing with every kind of lowlife at the Ford plant to get taken out by my own kid." After hanging up with Preston, I sat on that cabin bed for a moment, letting the reality sink in. This was really happening. My son wanted me dead, and I was trapped on a floating city in the middle of the ocean with whoever he'd hired to do the job. But I wasn't helpless. Never had been. Never would be. The thing about being 67 years old is that you've had time to accumulate some wisdom along the way. And one thing I'd learned, both in the jungle and on the factory floor, is that the best defense is often a good offense. First order of business was reconnaissance. I needed to know this ship like the back of my hand. Every exit, every hiding spot, every place where someone might try to hurt me. In Vietnam, we called it reading the terrain. Here, it meant learning how to stay alive on 12 decks of floating hotel. I spent the rest of that first day walking every corridor, riding every elevator, checking out every public space. The ship was impressive, I'll give it that. Multiple restaurants, bars, a casino that would make Las Vegas jealous, shops selling everything from jewelry to t-shirts, theaters for shows, libraries, even a rock climbing wall. It was like a small city, complete with its own security force and medical facilities. There had to be 2,000 passengers and crew aboard, which was both good news and bad news. Good, because it would be hard for someone to make me disappear without witnesses. Bad because with that many people around, a killer could blend in easily. I paid special attention to the security cameras. They were everywhere, in the hallways, the restaurants, the casino, even on some of the outer decks. That gave me some comfort. It would be difficult to stage an accident without leaving some kind of electronic trail. But I also noticed that the private cabin balconies had no camera coverage. Wesley had chosen my room very carefully indeed. That evening, I made my way to the main dining room for dinner. The place was elegant. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, waiters in bow ties serving food that probably cost more per plate than I used to make in a day. I found a table by the window where I could watch the ocean and keep an eye on the other diners. That's when I spotted him. There was a man sitting alone at the bar, maybe 45 years old, nursing a beer and watching the room like he was looking for someone specific. He was dressed casually, blue shirt, khakis, looked like any other tourist. But something about him felt wrong. You know how it is when you've been around long enough? You develop a sixth sense about people who don't belong, who aren't what they appear to be. This guy had that feeling about him. While everyone else was relaxed and enjoying their vacation, he seemed alert, focused, professional. And when our eyes met across that dining room, I knew I'd found Wesley's hired gun. The smart thing would have been to avoid him, to keep my distance and hope he didn't get a good look at me. But sometimes the smart thing isn't the right thing. I needed to know what I was dealing with, how good he was, how he operated, what his plan might be. So I did what any friendly old retiree might do. I walked over to introduce myself. "Excuse me, son," I said, approaching his table with my coffee cup in hand. "Mind if I sit?" I hate eating alone on vacation. He looked surprised, probably wasn't expecting his target to come right up and shake hands with him. But he recovered quickly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Of course, please. I'm Carlos," he said, extending his hand. Carlos. Probably not his real name, but it would do for now. His handshake was firm, calloused. This was a man who worked with his hands. Could be construction, could be something less legal. "Garrett," I replied, settling into the chair. "First cruise for me. You been on one of these floating hotels?" "Before. Second time," he said, studying my face like he was memorizing it. "There's something else, aren't they?" We made small talk for a few minutes. Where we were from, what we did for work, the usual vacation chatter. Carlos claimed to be from Dallas, said he was in construction. Might even have been true, though I doubted it. All the while I was playing the part of the harmless old man, complaining about my aching joints, talking about how my late wife would have loved this trip, mentioning how my balance wasn't what it used to be. "These ships can be tricky for us older folks," I said, lowering my voice like I was sharing a secret. "Yesterday I almost lost my footing just walking to the railing to look at the ocean. These old legs aren't as steady as they once were." Carlos's eyes sharpened with interest. "Really? You should be careful. Ship decks can be slippery, especially at night when the sea spray gets them wet." "Oh, I know," I said, nodding like a worried old fool. "My son Wesley warned me about that before I left. Told me to stay away from the railings, especially after dark when everything gets wet and slippery." I was feeding Carlos exactly the information he wanted to hear. That I was clumsy, unsteady, and likely to have an accident near the ship's railing. But I was also gathering intelligence. The way his eyes lit up when I mentioned being unsteady told me everything I needed to know about his plan. "What deck is your cabin on?" Carlos asked, trying to sound like he was just making conversation. "8th floor, room 847, I replied without hesitation. "Got a beautiful balcony that looks right out over the ocean, perfect for watching the sunset, though it makes me nervous being so close to all that water." Carlos smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. This was a predator who'd just been handed his prey on a silver platter. "Well, you just be careful, Mr. Garrett. Like I said, accidents happen on these ships more often than people think." "I appreciate the advice, son," I said, standing up slowly like my joints were giving me trouble. "Nice meeting you. Maybe I'll see you around the ship." As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back. Good. Let him think I was exactly what Wesley had told him, a helpless old man who'd be easy to eliminate. But here's what Carlos didn't know. While I was playing the confused retiree, I was also studying him. The way he held his shoulders told me he was probably armed. The calluses on his hands suggested he was comfortable with tools, or weapons. Most importantly, the questions he'd asked revealed his method of operation. He was planning to make my death look like I'd fallen from my balcony. probably late at night when there wouldn't be any witnesses. Simple, clean, and perfectly believable for a man my age who'd had too much to drink at dinner. Back in my cabin, I did something that might seem paranoid, but had kept me alive in Vietnam. I conducted a complete security sweep, checked the locks on the doors and windows, looked for any signs that someone had been inside, tested the balcony railing to see how much force it would take to go over. The railing came up to about my waist, plenty high enough to prevent an accidental fall, but low enough that someone could be pushed over if they were caught off guard. Carlos would probably try to drug me first, make me disoriented, then stage the accident. That night, I barely got any sleep. Every sound in the hallway made me tense. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from Wesley. "Hi, Dad. Hope you're settling in okay. How's the ship?" Even knowing what I knew, seeing that message from my son made my chest tight. Here was the boy I'd raised, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, checking up on me to make sure his hired killer could find me. I texted back, "Ship is incredible. Room has an amazing balcony view. Thanks again for this wonderful gift." I wanted Wesley to know I was still playing the grateful father, still trusting and naive. Let him think his plan was working perfectly. The next morning at breakfast, I spotted Carlos again. This time he was wearing a red shirt instead of blue, but it was definitely the same man. He was sitting 3 tables away, pretending to read the ship's daily newsletter while keeping an eye on me. Time for phase 2 of my counterattack. I had learned something important in Vietnam. The best way to defeat an enemy is to make them overconfident. Let them think they have the upper hand while you're actually controlling the situation. I spent that morning playing the perfect target. I walked slowly around the ship like my arthritis was bothering me. I sat alone by the pool, complaining loudly to anyone who'd listen about how the ship's motion was making me dizzy. I even staged a small stumble near the railing on the upper deck, making sure Carlos was watching. But while I was acting the part of the confused old man, I was also memorizing every detail of the ship's layout, where the security cameras were positioned, which crew members seemed alert and competent, how the ship's communication systems worked. Most importantly, I was learning Carlos's routine. He followed me at a distance, but he had patterns. He liked to position himself where he could watch multiple exits. He avoided areas with heavy security presence, and he seemed most comfortable in the evening hours when the lighting was dimmer. Around noon, I found the ship's internet cafe and sent another email to Preston Miller. I included everything I'd learned about Carlos, his appearance, his behavior patterns, the questions he'd asked. I also gave Preston more details about what I'd overheard Wesley saying. "This guy is definitely a professional," I wrote, "but he's getting overconfident because he thinks I'm an easy mark." That afternoon, while I was sitting by the pool pretending to read a paperback novel, something happened that changed everything. A man about my age approached my chair, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from years of hard work and harder decisions. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Mason Anderson from Denver. Mind if I join you? These deck chairs are hard to come by during peak hours." Mason was the kind of man you could trust on sight. Silver hair, calloused hands, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to know bullshit when they encountered it. He was wearing a simple polo shirt and khakis, nothing fancy, but everything about him screamed competence and reliability. "Garrett Sullivan from Houston," I replied, shaking his hand. "Please, sit down. Always nice to meet a fellow retiree." As we talked, I learned that Mason had a story similar to mine in many ways. He was a widower who'd spent 35 years as a contractor, building houses and commercial buildings throughout Colorado. Like me, he'd raised kids mostly on his own after his wife died young. Like me, he was taking his first real vacation in decades. "My kids insisted I take this trip," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "Said I'd been working too hard since retirement, spending too much time in my workshop building furniture nobody needs." "Same here," I replied. "My son Wesley gave me this cruise as a gift, said I needed to get away from the stress of everyday life." Something in the way I said Wesley's name must have caught Mason's attention because he gave me a long, measuring look. This was a man who'd spent decades reading people. Contractors have to be good judges of character to survive in that business. "You don't sound too happy about it," Mason observed. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. There was something about Mason that made me want to trust him. Maybe it was the fact that he was close to my age. Maybe it was the way he carried himself like a man who'd faced down his share of trouble. But Preston Miller's warning about taking unnecessary risks echoed in my head. "It's complicated," I said finally. Family always is. Mason nodded like he understood. You know, Garrett, I've been around long enough to recognize when a man's carrying more weight than he should. If you need someone to talk to, or if you need help with anything, I'm in cabin 1247 on the 12th deck. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, and my instincts told me that Mason Anderson was exactly the kind of ally I needed. Mason, I said, lowering my voice, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I think my son is trying to have me killed. Most people would have laughed, or suggested I see the ship's doctor, or made some excuse to leave. Mason just leaned forward slightly and said, "Tell me everything." For the next hour, sitting by that pool with the Caribbean sun beating down on us, I told Mason the whole story. The overheard phone conversation, Wesley's gambling debts, the life insurance money, Carlos following me around the ship. I showed him the text messages and explained my suspicions about how they planned to stage my accident. Mason listened without interrupting, asking only a few clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing everything I'd told him. "Garrett," he said finally, "I believe every word you just said, and I want you to know that you're not fighting this battle alone anymore." "Mason, I can't ask you to get involved in this. If I'm right about what's happening, you could be putting yourself in danger." "Friend," Mason replied with a grim smile, "I'm 65 years old. I've raised 4 kids, buried a wife, run my own business for 3 decades, and survived more family drama than you can shake a stick at. I'm not afraid of some hired thug who picks on old men. Having Mason on my side changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't a lone wolf trying to survive in hostile territory. I had backup, someone who could watch my 6 while I worked on gathering evidence. We spent the rest of the afternoon developing a strategy. Mason would keep an eye on Carlos while I continued playing the helpless victim. We'd document everything, take photos, record conversations if possible, and make sure there were witnesses to Carlos's suspicious behavior. The key, Mason said, is to make them think their plan is working perfectly while we're actually controlling the situation. That evening at dinner, we put our plan into action. I sat alone at my usual table, playing the lonely old man routine, while Mason positioned himself across the dining room where he could watch Carlos. Sure enough, my tail showed up right on schedule, wearing a different colored shirt but still keeping his eyes on me. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was Wesley, and I knew this call was important. I activated the recording app on my phone and answered. "Hi, son. How are things at home?" "Everything's fine, Dad. How's the cruise? Are you having fun?" His voice sounded perfectly normal, caring, concerned, like any loving son checking up on his father. If I hadn't heard him planning my murder, I would have believed he really cared about my well-being. "It's wonderful, Wesley. The ship is amazing, the food is incredible, and I'm meeting some nice people. Thank you so much for this generous gift. I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, Dad. You deserve it after working so hard all your life." There was a pause, then, "Have you been able to relax? Getting plenty of rest?" An interesting question. Was he asking because he cared about my health or because he wanted to know if I'd be an easy target? "Oh yes, I'm sleeping like a baby. This ocean air must be good for me. And my cabin is perfect. That balcony view is just spectacular." "That's great, Dad," Wesley said, and I could hear something else in his voice now, a kind of eagerness that made my skin crawl. "You mentioned the balcony. Do you spend much time out there?" Another loaded question. He was fishing for information about my routine, probably to pass along to Carlos. "Oh, every evening," I replied, making sure to sound enthusiastic. "I like to sit out there with a glass of wine and watch the sunset. It's so peaceful, just me and the ocean. Sometimes I stay out there pretty late, looking at the stars." Perfect. I was painting myself as a creature of habit who spent time alone in an isolated location. Exactly what Carlos needed to hear. "That sounds wonderful, Dad. You just be careful out there, okay? Those balcony railings can be tricky, especially if you've had a drink or two." The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. My own son, warning me to be careful while he was the one planning to have me thrown overboard. Don't worry, Wesley, I'm always careful. Though I have to admit, sometimes when I lean over that railing to look at the water, it makes me a little dizzy. These old bones aren't as steady as they used to be. Maybe you should stay away from the railing then, Dad. I'd hate for anything to happen to you. Would you really, Wesley? Would you really hate for something to happen to me? Or are you just making sure your hired killer knows exactly how to stage my accident? I'll be careful, son. I promise. Good. Well, I should let you go enjoy your vacation. Love you, Dad. Love you too, Wesley. As I hung up, I felt sick to my stomach. Those were probably the last words my son expected to say to me while I was still alive. He thought he was saying goodbye to a dead man. Mason appeared at my table a few minutes later, sliding into the chair across from me. Get all that? I asked quietly. Every word, he replied. That was your son asking you to map out your own murder, asking about your routine, suggesting you stay away from the balcony railing. That's not paternal concern, that's operational planning. We spent the next hour going over every detail of the conversation, identifying the key phrases that revealed Wesley's true intentions. Mason had been taking notes on his phone, documenting everything we'd observed about Carlos's behavior. Tomorrow night is the captain's formal dinner, Mason said. Big fancy affair, everyone dressed up, party goes late into the night. If I were planning to stage an accident, that's when I'd do it. Everyone will be distracted, security will be focused on the main events, and an old man stumbling back to his cabin after a night of drinking would be perfectly believable. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but it also crystallized my resolve. Tomorrow night, this would all be over one way or another. We need to contact the ship's security, I said. Agreed, but we need to do it smart. We can't just walk up to some junior officer and tell them there's a murder plot. We need to go straight to the top. Mason was right. This wasn't the kind of situation you handled through normal channels. We needed someone with real authority, someone who could act quickly and decisively. The next morning, we requested a meeting with Captain Hudson Parker. Getting to see the captain of a cruise ship isn't easy. These guys are busy running what amounts to a floating city. But Mason had an idea. I spent 35 years dealing with building inspectors, safety officials, and bureaucrats, he said. The trick is to use the magic words that make them pay attention. At the passenger services desk, Mason told the young officer that we had critical safety information regarding a potential threat to passenger welfare. Those words got us an appointment within 2 hours. Captain Parker's office was all business. Nautical charts on the walls, communication equipment, a large desk covered with operational documents. The captain himself was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that comes from years of command responsibility. Gentlemen, he said, gesturing for us to sit down, I understand you have safety concerns. Please tell me what's going on. I told him everything. The overheard conversation with Wesley, the financial motives, Carlos stalking me around the ship, the suspicious phone calls. I played the recorded conversation from the night before and showed him the text messages. Captain Parker listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Mr. Sullivan, he said when I finished, this is extremely grave. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're dealing with a planned murder attempt aboard my vessel. Captain, I know how this sounds, I replied, but I'm not some paranoid old man seeing conspiracies everywhere. I was a soldier. I know the difference between real threats and imagination. This threat is real. I believe you, the captain said firmly, and I want you to know that from this moment forward, you're under this ship's protection. We'll increase security around your area and keep surveillance on this Carlos individual. Captain, with respect, I think we can do better than just playing defense, Mason interjected. We think Carlos will make his move tomorrow night during the formal dinner. Instead of just trying to prevent it, why don't we catch him in the act? Captain Parker leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. That would be extremely dangerous, Mr. Anderson. We'd essentially be using Mr. Sullivan as bait. I've been bait before, I said. In Vietnam, we called it point man duty. Sometimes you have to take risks to eliminate a threat permanently. The captain studied both of us for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing? Mason outlined our plan. Tomorrow night, I would go to the formal dinner as planned, then return to my cabin at the expected time. But instead of staying there, I would slip out and hide in a nearby location, while ship security monitored my room and the surrounding area. If Carlos tries to enter your cabin or access your balcony, we'll have him dead to rights, Captain Parker said. But gentlemen, I cannot stress enough how dangerous this could be. If something goes wrong... Captain, I interrupted. I've been in situations where the margin for error was a lot smaller than this. Besides, what's the alternative? Spend the rest of the cruise hiding in my room while this guy waits for another opportunity? The captain nodded slowly. Very well. We'll do this, but we do it my way. I'll have my best security officers positioned throughout the area, and you'll be wearing a panic device that will bring help immediately if anything goes wrong. The rest of that day crawled by like a week in hell. Mason and I went over the plan a dozen times, checking every detail, preparing for every contingency we could think of. I tried to maintain my routine, ate lunch alone, took a slow walk around the deck, even had another brief conversation with Carlos where I mentioned how much I was looking forward to the formal dinner. Big night tonight, I told him, playing the excited tourist. First time I've ever been to one of these fancy captain's dinners. Probably stay up way too late celebrating. Carlos smiled, that predatory smile of his. Sounds like fun. You just be careful walking back to your room afterward. Sometimes people have a little too much to drink at these events. Oh, I'll be careful, I assured him. Though between you and me, I'm not much of a drinker anymore. One glass of wine and I'm practically asleep on my feet. Perfect. I was painting myself as the ideal victim. Unsteady, predictable, and likely to be semi-conscious when he made his move. The formal dinner was held in the ship's grand ballroom, a spectacular space with crystal chandeliers, elegant table settings, and a live orchestra. Under different circumstances, I might have actually enjoyed it. The food was excellent, the music was beautiful, and the other passengers were having the time of their lives. But all I could think about was what was waiting for me back in my cabin. I made sure to be seen by plenty of people during the dinner, playing the part of the friendly retiree having a wonderful time. I took pictures with other passengers, chatted with the waiters, even danced a few songs with some of the ladies whose husbands were too tired to get on the dance floor. Around 11:30 p.m., I made my exit, loudly telling anyone within earshot that I was tired and needed to get back to my room. Big day tomorrow visiting Cozumel, I announced. Better get my beauty sleep. I walked slowly to the elevator, making sure Carlos could see me leaving. In the reflection of the elevator doors, I caught sight of him getting up from his table across the room. The hunt was on. Instead of going to my floor, I took the elevator up to the 12th deck where Mason was waiting. Captain Parker had arranged for us to use an empty cabin 2 doors down from Mason's room, 1249, which had a perfect view of the corridor leading to my actual cabin 8 floors below. He's coming, I told Mason as I slipped into the surveillance room. Probably give me 10 or 15 minutes to get settled, then make his move. Captain Parker was already there with 2 of his security officers, monitoring multiple camera feeds on a tablet computer. We have eyes on your corridor, Mr. Sullivan. The moment anyone approaches your cabin, we'll know about it. The waiting was the hardest part. In Vietnam, at least when you were in contact with the enemy, you knew what was happening. This was different. Sitting in that dark room, watching camera feeds, knowing that my life depended on a plan that had a dozen different ways to go wrong. At 12:15 a.m., one of the security officers pointed at his screen. There. Stairwell exit, 8th deck. Single male. Approximately 45. Dark clothing. It was Carlos, moving carefully through the corridor toward my cabin. He was wearing black clothes now instead of his usual tourist outfit, and he was carrying something in his right hand that I couldn't quite make out. He's got lockpicks, Captain Parker said, zooming in on the image. Professional grade. This guy's done this before. We watched as Carlos approached my cabin door and knelt down to work on the lock. It took him less than 30 seconds to get inside. Definitely a professional. Teams in position, Captain Parker spoke into his radio. Suspect has entered the target cabin. Maintain surveillance and await my signal. For the next few minutes, we could see occasional flashes of light through my cabin windows as Carlos moved around inside with a flashlight. He was probably checking to make sure I wasn't there, looking for signs of where I might have gone. Then he appeared on my balcony. Even through the camera feed, I could see him examining the railing, probably planning exactly how he was going to stage my accident. He pulled out what looked like a small bottle, probably a sedative to drug me with before throwing me overboard. That's our evidence right there, Mason whispered. Breaking and entering, plus whatever's in that bottle. Carlos spent about 10 minutes on my balcony, taking measurements and testing different angles. He was being thorough, professional. This wasn't his first time staging a murder to look like an accident. Finally, he seemed satisfied with his preparations and headed back toward the cabin door. That's when Captain Parker gave the signal. All teams, move in. Take him alive. What happened next was like something out of a movie. Security officers appeared from both ends of the corridor simultaneously, trapping Carlos between them as he tried to leave my cabin. "Ship security, stop right there." Carlos froze for about 2 seconds, then tried to bolt back into my cabin. Big mistake. There were already officers coming through the balcony door behind him. The whole thing was over in less than 30 seconds. Carlos found himself surrounded by 6 ship security officers with nowhere to run. Even if he'd wanted to jump overboard, we were in the middle of the Caribbean with the nearest land hundreds of miles away. "Hands where we can see them," the lead officer shouted. "Get down on the ground, now!" Carlos raised his hands slowly, but I could see him calculating, looking for any possible escape route. This was a man who'd probably talked his way out of trouble before, or fought his way out when talking didn't work. But there was nowhere to go, and no one to fight. He dropped to his knees and let them cuff him without resistance. "What's in the bottle?" Captain Parker demanded as they searched Carlos. "I don't know what you're talking about," Carlos replied. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." "No mistake," the captain said grimly. "You just broke into a passenger's cabin carrying burglary tools and an unknown substance. We'll let the Coast Guard sort out the details when we reach port." They found quite a bit more than just the bottle. Carlos had lockpicks, a small crowbar, and what looked like a telescoping rod, probably for checking the balcony railing to make sure it would give way at the right moment. Most damning of all, they found his cell phone. "Mr. Sullivan," Captain Parker said to me later in his office, "you need to see these text messages." The phone contained a detailed conversation between Carlos and Wesley, going back 3 weeks. Wesley's instructions were spelled out in black and white. Wait until after the formal dinner. Make it look like he fell from the balcony by accident. Make sure there are no signs of struggle. Reading those messages, written in my son's own words, hit me harder than I'd expected. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision driven by desperation. Wesley had been planning my murder for weeks, working out every detail with a professional killer. There were other messages too, discussions about payment, backup plans if the balcony method didn't work, even contingencies for what to do if I became suspicious. Wesley had thought of everything except the possibility that his old man might fight back. "We also found bank records on his phone," Captain Parker continued. "Carlos received a $25,000 deposit 2 weeks ago from an account registered to Wesley Sullivan. He was supposed to get another $25,000 when the job was completed. $50,000. That's what my life was worth to my son. Less than what I used to make in a year at the Ford plant. Less than the cost of the cruise he'd bought to lure me to my death. What happens now, Captain?" "Now Carlos goes into our security holding cell until we reach port tomorrow morning. The Coast Guard will be waiting to arrest him for attempted murder, breaking and entering, and conspiracy. You'll have all the evidence you need to prosecute your son when we get back to the mainland." That night, my last night on the cruise, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I was processing everything that had happened. In the space of 1 week, I'd gone from being a trusting father to understanding that my own child wanted me dead. Mason sat with me in his cabin, sharing a bottle of whiskey he'd brought from home. "You know what the hardest part is?" I said, staring out at the dark ocean through his balcony door. "It's not that Wesley tried to kill me. It's that I have to accept I never really knew him at all." "Maybe you knew the boy he used to be," Mason replied. "But people change, Garrett. Sometimes they change into something you wouldn't recognize. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed over the years, the lies, the manipulation, the way he only called when he needed money. I made excuses for him because he was my son, but deep down, I think I knew what kind of man he was becoming." Mason poured us both another drink. "You can't blame yourself for wanting to believe in your kid. That's what good fathers do." The next morning, as the ship pulled into Galveston port, I watched Carlos being led off in handcuffs by Coast Guard officers. He looked smaller somehow, less threatening in the bright Texas sunshine. Just a middle-aged man in an orange jumpsuit who'd made the mistake of underestimating his target. Detective Rodriguez of the Galveston Police was waiting for me at the gangway with a thick folder of paperwork. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, shaking my hand, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented attempted murder cases I've ever seen. Between the recorded phone conversations, the text messages, the physical evidence, And the fact that we caught the perpetrator in the act, your son is looking at serious prison time. The flight back to Houston felt like returning from a war zone, which, in a way, it was. I'd survived a battle that I never should have had to fight, against an enemy who should have been my strongest ally. Preston Miller met me at the airport with even more bad news about Wesley's finances. "It's worse than we thought, Garrett," he said as we drove toward the police station. "Wesley didn't just owe $95,000 in gambling debts, he's been using your identity to take out loans, forge checks, even put a second mortgage on your house without your knowledge. The total fraud is over $200,000. How long has this been going on? At least 8 months, maybe longer. He's been systematically looting your assets while planning your murder. If you died, he would have inherited everything clean and free, with no one left who knew about the fraud. It was worse than greed or desperation. Wesley had been treating me like a walking bank account, something to be cashed in when the time was right." 2 hours later, I was sitting in the Houston Police Department giving my statement to Detective Linda Hayes, a sharp woman about 50 with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of the best sergeants I'd known in Vietnam. "Mr. Sullivan," she said after reviewing all the evidence Preston had gathered, based on the cruise ship incident, the financial fraud we've uncovered, and the documented conspiracy to commit murder, "we're issuing arrest warrants for Wesley and Rachel Sullivan immediately." "How long before they're arrested?" "They'll be in custody before sunset. We have units heading to their house right now." Sure enough, at 6 p.m. my phone rang with the news. Detective Hayes sounded satisfied when she told me they'd found Wesley and Rachel packing suitcases, with plane tickets to Mexico City in Rachel's purse. They'd been planning to run the moment they heard I was dead. "Found something else interesting too," Detective Hayes added. Rachel had already been shopping for new identities, fake passports, birth certificates, the whole package. These two had an exit strategy that went way beyond just collecting your insurance money. That night, alone in my house for the first time in over a week, I sat in my old recliner and tried to process everything that had happened. My son had tried to kill me. The boy I'd raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, had hired professional killers to throw me off a cruise ship balcony. But I'd survived. More than that, I'd fought back and won. The trial took place 4 months later. Wesley tried every trick in the book, claimed he was coerced by loan sharks, said the text messages were taken out of context, even suggested that I was a confused old man who'd misunderstood innocent conversations. His lawyer painted him as a desperate man who'd made a terrible mistake, but never really intended to hurt anyone. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recorded phone conversations where Wesley discussed my death in cold detail, the text messages with Carlos containing specific instructions for staging my murder, the financial records showing months of systematic fraud, the testimony from the cruise ship crew who'd caught Carlos red-handed in my cabin with lockpicks and sedatives. Most damning of all was Carlos himself. Faced with spending the rest of his life in prison, he'd decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He testified that Wesley had hired him specifically to kill me and make it look like an accident, that he'd been paid $25,000 up front, with another $25,000 promised upon completion of the job. Wesley Sullivan told me his father was an easy target, Carlos testified from the witness stand. He said the old man was clumsy, unsteady on his feet, and wouldn't be missed by anyone except family. He gave me detailed information about his father's cabin, his routine, even suggestions about the best time to stage the accident. Sitting in that courtroom, watching Wesley try to explain to a jury why he'd hired killers to murder his own father, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, but pity. This was a man so consumed by greed and entitlement that he'd lost every shred of human decency. Wesley was sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and financial fraud. Rachel got 7 years as an accomplice. When the judge read those verdicts, I didn't feel joy, but I felt justice had been served. After the trial, I made some major changes in my life. I sold the house in Houston. Too many painful memories, too much history I needed to leave behind. With the money from the sale, I bought a small cabin on Lake Travis, about an hour outside Austin. Just a simple place with a dock where I could fish and work on boat engines. But the most important change was what I did with my time. I started volunteering at the Austin VFW, helping other veterans who were having family problems. You'd be amazed how many older men get taken advantage of by their own children and grandchildren. They feel ashamed, like they failed as parents, so they suffer in silence. Gentlemen, I tell them during our weekly support group meetings, I want to share the story of how my own son tried to have me murdered on a cruise ship, and how I fought back and won. Every time I tell my story, I see recognition in their eyes, the understanding that they don't have to be victims, that being older doesn't mean being helpless, that they have more strength and resources than they realize. Mason Anderson visits me at the lake house every few months. He's become more than a friend. He's the brother I never had, the family I chose instead of the one I was born with. We fish, drink beer, and talk about how much our lives changed during those 7 days at sea. You ever regret how it all went down? He asked during his last visit. Mason, I replied without hesitation, I regret that it came to that. I regret that I raised a son who valued money more than family, but I don't regret fighting back, and I don't regret winning. It's been 2 years since that cruise. I'm 69 now, and I've never felt more alive. I've got my boat repair business, my volunteer work, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Sarah died. Every morning I wake up to the sound of water lapping against my dock, and I'm grateful for another day that Wesley's plan failed to take away from me. Last month I got a letter from Wesley in prison. He wanted to reconcile and asked me to visit him. I read it once, then used it to start a fire in my fireplace. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. I'm Garrett Sullivan, and I'm a survivor. When a man like me says, if you want to play games, boy, let's play, that's not a threat, that's a promise. And Wesley learned the hard way that his old man always keeps his promises. The end.